Exactly. And also it'll inform you of when to use server components and when not to. I think it's true that server components can add value to literally every React application on earth.
Today, I'm interviewing Tejas Kumar, an international keynote speaker with an engineering background spanning 22 years. We're going to have to talk about that in a bit. But at React Day Berlin, you're going to be talking about React server components. So welcome, Tejas. It's an honor. Thank you for stopping by.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Awesome. All right. So before we get into all of the bits and pieces, I like to do what I call the technology icebreaker, quick, lightning round questions. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and you just say the first thing that pops in your mind.
Lightning round.
Tabs or spaces?
Spaces.
Semicolons or no semicolons?
Semicolons.
Mac, Windows, or Linux?
Mac.
All right. This could be a make or break on our friendship. Your favorite code editor or IDE?
VS Code. No question.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, good.
And you think I was going to say JetBrains?
Just making sure. Okay, last one. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Yeah, no, I'm a coffee guy too. Let's start talking about actually your 22 years of engineering experience. How is that even possible? What got you into development? Give us the quick background on Tejas.
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up very ill, such that I couldn't do anything physical without having serious health problems. And so the only thing that I could do was virtual things. And so we had when I was 4 years old, we had a tiny little Windows 3.1 computer, and there was Prince of Persia. There were a bunch of games, but there was no internet. So at some point you finish all the games and you go like, okay, well, I'm bored now. And that's when I found, Notepad, and had my brother show me how to write HTML. And he was like, save this with .html, and look, it opens in Internet Explorer and it's a web page. And I was like, what? No way. I've seen these things. Companies have them. That's what it takes. And I was so mind blown that was when I was 8 years old at the time, when I wrote my first HTML page and by extension website, and that got quite a bit of attention in the local media. I was in magazines and things because they were like, what? There's a child making websites. We need to write about this. So that was the beginning.
That's amazing. I think we have a very similar background then, because our first computer, it was Windows 3.1, and I wrote my first website. How old was I? I don't know. It was in 1995, and I don't know. I think I wasn't 8. I must have been 15 or so. Yeah, but pretty amazing. Amazing times to grow up in and to start creating in, and then seeing how far we've come from then to now.
It's interesting because a lot of people, well, not a lot, but some people attribute some form of success to me. They say, hey, you have a great career and things like that. And I often feel a bit of imposter syndrome around this, because I was much like you, right? We both existed at the time where the internet was born. The internet was invented like a year or two before I was born. So me and the internet were born around the same time. Therefore, when it was in its infancy, as was I, and we kind of grew together. And now it's this giant thing. And I'm not a giant thing, but we grow in parallel pathways. So I think a lot of it is just really luck and spawning in the right place and time.
Yeah, for sure. So what got you from there to here? Anything in particular?
That's a good question. Yeah, it was just a lot of curiosity. HTML and CSS were as far as I got with some rudimentary JavaScript, but I love design. There's this paper, a piece of paper where one of the early Apple designers drew a water droplet and how water would reflect shadows and light and things like that. I didn't see this when I was a child, but I did see the macOS Aqua user interface. And back in those days, man, they used to do this Tux. I don't know if you're familiar with Tux, the penguin. This was like a mascot or something, Linux or something. And they would make these crystal tuxes that looked shiny and beautiful. DeviantArt.com, I used to use that heavily back then. And I was just like, wow, how do you make this? And so I used to follow tutorials and make graphics with Photoshop. I got really good at Photoshop when I was 10. And then from there I was like, wait, I could draw websites in Photoshop. And so moved from that to actually designing the pages in Photoshop using the slicing tool, where then you can export them as HTML. And I was like, whoa, you could just do full design websites. And went from that to front page to Dreamweaver to, okay, I'm just going to write HTML because it's easier in Notepad++. And ultimately front end started specializing, and I was like, oh, definitely I'm front end. There's no way. I've started with Photoshop, for goodness sakes, right? and eventually applied for a front-end engineer position in Germany and moved over for that. Been doing front-end for a while, but eventually was in a place too often where like the UI was ready, but it was blocked by the feature was blocked by some API dependency. Some backend code wasn't yet shipped, and I was like, why? And I used to get really frustrated. I'm sure you can relate. To where I just decided, you know what, I'm going to quit and become a backend engineer. So I did that for a couple of years. And then my backends were blocked by deployment infrastructure with Kubernetes and things like that. And I was like, what is going on? And so I quit and became a DevOps engineer for a couple of years. And now I kind of just know my way around the stack and do a little bit of everything.
So yeah, you talked about like Dreamweaver. That takes me back a long time ago. I think I was using Dreamweaver and I was creating Adobe Flash animations. And so like, that was some fun days. I remember that. That's amazing how you went into all of these different areas, and it kind of goes back to like the key skill for any developer is being curious and learning, and that's like the main thing is if like you have to constantly adapt and learn in this environment that we live in. Like nothing stays the same, so you have to constantly learn. So if you don't love to learn and you're not curious, you're going to be kind of stagnant. And that's how you got to, throughout your career is being curious and learning.
Right. And I think it's important to distinguish or to dive a little bit into learning, right? Because like learning means different things in different geographies. Sure. And I grew up in the Indian school system, which is frankly a dumpster fire, right? And I say that with respect for actual educational institutions and actual learning, because in the institution that I grew up in, and a lot of my Indian peers grew up in, the concept of learning is not so much understanding such that you can then explain it to someone else. It's more memorizing the thing and then regurgitating the information. So literally, they had us in computer class memorize code. So this is a function that does a thing. Just memorize it, and then we need you to write it down in the exam. And you ask questions about, okay, but why? How does it work? How does the compiler? What is a compiler? Etc. It's no. You're asking too many questions. Just memorize it. And so learning, like nobody wants to learn like that, right? But if it's driven by how does this actually work? How I want to understand it so then I can teach someone else. I want to understand it so then I can think about how I make it faster. I want to understand it so maybe I can start a company around it. Like that type of learning, I think is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I love that approach. That's the approach that I generally take is when I learn something is I learn it because I want to teach it. And, through, social media and YouTube, etc., through talks in person at conferences, like the learning in order to teach, even if you don't want to, start a YouTube channel or be a conference speaker, write a small article about this new thing that you just learned and put it out there, and it's going to help someone.
Yeah, exactly. Like one of my favorite people through history is Dr. Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, worked on the Manhattan Project, among other things. And he says, we don't really, I'm paraphrasing, but he says we don't really understand anything unless we can speak about it in lay people terms. And I love that because that's also the antidote to like imposter syndrome. I was early in my career, a bunch of people didn't understand a bunch of things. And so I'd ask questions and they'd respond to me with like the most esoteric language I've ever heard in my life, which I didn't know how to say, hey, I was scared to say, hey, I didn't understand your clarification. Can you help me more? Because I fully anticipated a response of, what are you, stupid or something? And all these years later, I find out that they just couldn't explain it because they themselves didn't know it, right? And I think if we can share that message with some early career developers around, hey, if somebody can explain something, or if you're not understanding someone's explanation, it's not you, it's them. I think that's a really important message.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Anytime I'm trying to help someone through something, I always tell them, first off, there are no stupid questions. If you don't understand something, please ask.
Yeah. And
Awesome.
If I can explain it to you, let's go learn it together.
Exactly. Perfect. Cool. So I mean, great background. Love it. It's a great experience to share with everyone. And well, let's go ahead and talk about now what you're going to be speaking about at the React Day Berlin conference, React Server Components. So can you give us like a sneak peek at a little preview of what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, actually, I can give you an entire spoiler of what I'm going to be talking about because Dan Abramov wrote a long documentation page about it and said, hey, whoever wants to talk about this, you have full license, go nuts. And I spoke with him about it, and I said, dude, can I talk about this? He was like, yeah, sure. So that link we'd probably put somewhere on your channel or something. But yeah, so Dan wrote a discussion on GitHub called Server Components from Scratch. And it's approaching server components through the lens of first principles, right? Like, what if React didn't exist and React started with the server? And it breaks down how server components work, how they execute, what the connection between server components and server-side rendering is. Can you use RSC, that's React Server Components, without server-side rendering? You can. Should you? That's another question. And it's a nice primer on what they are conceptually, because in the world of server components, a client is a server. And this is so weird. A client of a server component is the server that then takes the server component's JSX and transforms it into HTML. So these terms, client, server, etc., become very flexible. And that article explains it. And indeed, that's what my talk will do as well. My talk is just that article, but with my teaching style and some live demos applied at React Day Berlin. So more concretely, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a very basic client-rendered app, client-only rendered app that does some data fetching. And we will add server-side rendering to it. And then the server-side rendering is going to be great, right? But it's going to send down the wire the page without any data fetched, because server rendering doesn't solve the fetching problem. And so once we have this like partial page that's server rendered, we say, okay, how can we finish it? And then we implement server-side component rendering with data fetching. So we'll do some RSC stuff, render that on the server, and then send a complete data fetched page to the client without any React on the client side to start with. And depending on how much time the talk is, if it's a bit longer, we might also then pick up the server components on the client side and do things like soft navigation and other things that you can do with server components on both sides of the stack. But if we have 20 minutes like we do in London, I don't think we're going to do the client side.
Nice. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. React Server Components are amazing, and understanding like the key differences between all of these different terminologies. That's always a key thing whenever you're going into learning something. Is there's always these acronyms and these things that maybe not everyone understands, and so going in and defining them and seeing like React Server Components is actually a big deal, and like it can actually help, and knowing how they actually work on the back end is going to help you to design your applications better, so make them faster, etc.
Exactly, and also it'll inform you of when to use server components and when not to, when not to reach for it. And I think it's true that server components can add value to literally every React application on Earth. But the reality is, at this point in time, there's a lot of people who aren't even on a framework, right? They're just like straight up client-side dashboards. And while RSC can help that use case, there's considerations around, is it worth re-architecting this entire thing for those benefits? And that's a difficult question. And that's the question that talk like this aims to answer in 20 minutes. And if it fails, then that's what the hallway track is for.
I'm sure it's going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to it. Anything, so I think that's been a great explanation of it, and I'm really looking forward to it. Anything that you want to add before we wrap up?
I want to shout out my home city, man. I live in Berlin. I'm based in Berlin. This conference is in Berlin. That doesn't happen often. So, I'd love to hang out with whoever comes out. Buy them a meal, have them even over at my house, and just really extend some hospitality and love to the community.
Looking forward to it. So again, React Day Berlin is going to be December the 8th. If you haven't signed up already, you can sign up with the link in the video description. And if you can't make it in person, that's okay too. There is going to be remote sessions as well. So again, link in the video description. Thank you again, Tejas, for joining me, and I'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, man. Yeah, I just want to say thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure, Jesse, to chat with you, and I look forward to seeing you in Berlin. Bye.
Awesome. We'll see you. Thank you.